will say I'm not strong because I see that they're talking about the imaginary before moving into the displaced represented. But I might, I'm more comfortable with the semiotics than I am the Lacanianism.
I thought exactly my problem with the whole semiotics thing is exactly that I don't know Lacan. So
yeah, I don't know him very well either, but based on the chart I made when we last talked about the representation and repression, which I think was like 3.8, probably earlier. It was probably like 3.6 now that I think about it, but I've got the displaced representation, the displaced represented as the signified.
the display, yes. Yes, exactly. And so basically, well, the argument they are making, and in this section here, they just summarize what they've said earlier, right? So the argument that they are here making is how Oedipus is moving through this whole thing from the savage system to the capitalist system. And in the capitalist system, the displaced represented has become as such the representation of desire. Basically, that's the point they've talked earlier, about which they've talked earlier, that the signified and the referent are one now. So that's basically the whole thing about simulacra. But I have no idea about the mechanics of this whole thing. Like, I do not really understand what it means for the signified to be unoccupied.
Let me see. I watched a lecture on Lacan, and this conversation is kind of reminding me of a bit at the end where the lecturer gave this like timeline of what of basically how the phallus kind of comes to constitute the Oedipal triangle in Lacan, and I'm gonna try to like find it in my notes that I took and like re-go over it, because I think it's like they're purposely paralleling it in a way.
Yeah. But this, so the sentence where this whole thing starts, where what I'm talking about, is basically Oedipus was always the displaced limit for every social formation, since it is the displaced representative of desire. But in the primitive formations, this limit remains vacant, precisely insofar as the flows are coded and as the interplay of alliances and filiations keeps families extended according to the scale of the determinations of the social field, preventing any secondary reduction of the latter to the former. In the despotic formations, the Oedipal limit is occupied, symbolically occupied, but not lived or inhabited, something like that. Inasmuch as the imperial incest affects an overcoding that in turn surveys the entire social field from above, the repressing representation. The formal operations of flattening, extrapolation, and so on, that later belong to Oedipus, are already sketched out, but within a symbolic space where the object from on high is formed. It is only in the capitalist formation that the Oedipal limit finds itself not only occupied, but inhabited and lived. In the sense in which the social images produced by the decoded flows actually fall back on restricted familial images invested by desire. At this point, the imaginary that Oedipus is constituted, at the same time as it completes its migration in the in-depth elements of representation. The displaced represented has become as such the representation of desire. So, and I got the feeling that I should understand this after reading the third chapter, but I absolutely don't.
It's interesting that it ends its migration in the imaginary. I have to think about that for a second.
I mean, when we want to parallel this with Lacan, we have to know that this is a historical migration, right? So in Lacan, we would basically always be in either the despotic or the capitalist system. I'm not quite sure where Deleuze and Guattari place Lacan, but this migration isn't happening on an individual level.
Okay, now here. So I've got my notes from that Lacan lecture in front of me. That and basically what this lecture, it's like by a PhD student in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he's giving like an introduction to the Oedipal triangle, the way that Lacan thinks about Oedipus. And the story that he says he gives for Lacan's Oedipus is that it starts with like as a baby, right? There's this like stages of development that this baby goes through where the baby feels like mom doesn't address a certain need, right? And that mom has a real lack of something. And then it goes from that to like, I'm doing a bad job of explaining this. But there's like there's stages of like infantile development that I think are being paralleled here where according to Lacan, the baby can't figure out, what mom needs other than the baby, so that the baby's needs aren't being addressed by the mom, right? And then the baby moves to the symbolic or like area where they start looking at the dad and crap. At any rate, I'm really, really reminded of that sort of timeline from Lacan, but Deleuze and Guattari are playing it out with like historical stages instead of it being a baby's timeline, right? And both timelines end in the imaginary because the child is Lacan's the imaginary and the child in the Oedipal triangle are supposed to be like the same spot in the triangle. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that might make sense that they end basically on the Lacanian notion of Oedipus, because that's what they are doing, right? They're historicizing this whole triangle.
Mm.
But I think the movements that are described by them and by Lacan are different movements. Like Lacan describes the formation of a subject, and they are describing the formation of the formations that form the subject.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think because they are also talking about subject formation, but they're talking about it in a way where like, don't they say earlier that like the subject isn't open to the social field and that those two things aren't really closed off from one another? Yeah. And then I'm also reminded of, so like the way the lecturer ended the lecture, he started talking about masculine and feminine subjects. The idea that the like simple way that he described it was that masculine subjects, try to possess the phallus, what is it? Adopting the authority of the law in order to have a substitute for the phallus. And then that the feminized subject is about like, what is it? Like sort of becoming that object of desire, becoming that sort of lost object. Maybe it's too early for me to make these kind of connections. It's been too long since I've been reading this book. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to do everything very sketchily.
Do you have a link to that lecture?
I do. Give me 1 second. I sent it a while ago. I'll send it again.
Yeah, but my overall impression was anyway that I should probably read up on Lacan before going back to both the second and the third chapter.
This lecture was really helpful. So I recommend checking it out, but it's like an hour and a half long.
Jack, do you have any thoughts on this whole thing?
I think so. Can I just ask can I ask for the page number for the quote you read before I give them to you?
266 in the PDF. I don't know which version that is.
Got it. Oedipus was always... So, I mean, you can see the retrospective lens, right? With the displaced limit there, you can kind of see the lens of a little bit of capitalism there, but obviously that's a common theme throughout the genealogy, but my impression was that even if Oedipus is the limit, right, like you don't, at least in my impression from these sections is that you don't see Oedipus in the primitive or the despotic. And I think they even write during the despotic machine section of representation that the conditions aren't there yet because Oedipus needs something more than just overcoding. And so, like, my impression of when they're talking about the signifier and the referent collapsing in that way is like, and the point about occupied and lived is like, in those other two representational machines, we don't find anybody living out the Oedipal thing. Because right, they take the pains to talk about how colonialization brings that to them, right, and that there's this whole process to Oedipalize because it's not there just yet. It's almost like an export in that regard. For those of you keeping score in Keynesian GDP, but joking aside, my impression is that when they're talking about the signify and the referent collapsing there, and like the displaced represented or the displacement of desire, it sounds to me like it's Oedipus is vacuous as a limit in that regard. Like nobody's really living out that fantasy. And in fact, I would go so far as to say like Oedipus in the story of Oedipus isn't Oedipalized. Because it's one, it's not capitalism, but two, under the despotic machine, that's ironically not exactly possible, right? It's not the story we know, even though we look back on it, perhaps in that regard. And so it seems like when the when the semiotic aspect collapses like that, it sounds like we get into this problem, like you're saying, of subjectivity and creating the subject, right, where it becomes difficult not to at least speak of Oedipus, right? Or even whether it's an enunciation or perhaps more directly in what we write, there's this problem that Oedipus allows for a sort of displacement, right? Whether it's through interpretation or what have you, where desire would seem to be congealing around Oedipus.
Okay. Yeah, I think I got something from that. But how would you formulate works this in the despotic system where they say that the Oedipal limit is symbolically occupied but not lived or inhabited? So basically, that's the kind of repression they talked earlier about, where desire actually targets something else than what repression says that you want.
For the sake of a disclaimer, like I said, the Lacanianism is not my forte, but I'll still take a stab at that question. So what I was getting out of that sentence is that so like there's still these concerns about incest, right? In the despotic, there's concerns about incest in relation to the despotic, right, due to overcoding, and that's in relation to right, that's the overcoding of the primitive territorial representation, where incest looks a little bit different, right, because we don't have the despotic lineage and those wonderful perverts. So I think the thing about the occupation is like, I took that as meaning, and I could be wrong here, but I took that as meaning like, even if the conditions are there for Oedipus, which we know in the despotic they're not quite there yet, nobody's living it. The Oedipal subjectivity or the Oedipal displacement, right? Because I think that's kind of what they're getting at with the referent, is that it can be, now there's a place for desire to seemingly flow, right? Even if it is a paralogism, it's got an object more directly as opposed to something more like semiotic for these purposes. Or I guess I should say, like, when I say semiotic, I mean like a physical marking or a mental aspect, like more directly, like there's there seems to me that you can actually do and perhaps be Oedipal things, as opposed to like the question of whether or not there are Oedipal markings in the territorial.
Okay, like I think I try to figure out how this relates to the despot, because in the capitalist system, that's what they do in the paragraphs prior to this section. It's very clear. The family members, father and mother, and the child become simulacra, in the sense that the displaced representative has. That's basically what they say when they say the displaced representative has become the representation of desire. They both are actual persons and are these societal positions. I'm butchering this, but maybe we should go back to the simulacra a bit. I'll look for that one.
While you're looking for that, I like your point too, because one of the things that's kind of stuck out to me as I've been reading this and reflecting more is like with the discussion on codes, and even like you're saying with like with how that relates to the social, right? So like things like institutions or social place, right? Especially in the representation. I've been toying with the notion that this really strikes at the heart of like a superego. That is to say, like the part of their, so like the way they're walking out codes, the way they're walking out representations, and the way it works as a territory, especially in relation to socius. It struck me that it sounds like what they're doing is they're going like, in a similar way like that we've talked about, how like they've kind of inverted the ego, or like forget the id, right? Like they say at the beginning, what a mistake to have spoken of the id. It seems like they're doing something kind of similar with the superego.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that they are kind of, they're very indebted to psychoanalysis for the like ideas of these like superegos and the Lacanian structure of the family, but they really are trying to like, I don't know if dismantle is the right word, but they're trying to re-impregnate it with like a social consciousness that is kind of not there. When you're looking at like Lacan or Freud, all these things are just supposed to be, the structures of the psyche, detached from the sort of politics that, might constitute the ability to write a book about the psyche, or, experience the psyche. They're sort of opening up the superego and the id to the social field, and the ego. They're opening all of these things up to the social field, which is why I think they do this sort of rhetorical, like paralleling the stages of development in psychoanalysis with different eras of like, history. And that's how they end up saying like, oh, the Oedipal triangle is a universal history, but only in the condition that it ends in capitalism.
Of course. And that's kind of why I bring up the point before we move into simulacra. And it may help us, perhaps. But so, right, like the superego, as I've always conceived it, is supposed to be kind of like the social voice that acts as like your conscience in a sense, right? Like it seems really personal and individual to me, despite the social connection. And maybe that's a viable interpretation, but what I've kind of been noodling on reading this book, reading Anti-Oedipus, is that it's not so personal, right? And like, it's not so much like, it's not quite like Kafka, where you've got right out of the trial, where you're being spoken at, right? It's not so like, it's maybe there is resentment, but it's not quite in that way. That is to say, like, because they've got this notion of cathexis, which I think is really helpful here. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday with like enunciation and writing, but because you are using codes, right? And it's kind of unavoidable, yeah. But because you're participating with codes, and especially if you're moving through the representation and Oedipus is circulating, as I believe they say it does during capitalism, especially with this displacement, right? That's not so much. That's not. Doesn't seem like this idea that the superego is speaking at you is going to be helpful here, because you're actively doing it, right? You're investing in it in a cycle. Well, and not only are you investing in it, but it's socially invested in, right? Like, you're not the only one speaking the code. Others around you that you're connected with are speaking the code, right? It's not so. It doesn't seem to boil down to your individual like take on society.
Yeah, and that I think gets at what you reminded me of is what's useful about their way of talking about schizophrenia, right? Because they have these codes, these territorialities, whatever you want to call it, these sort of structures that are circulated throughout society. And when you can't, for whatever reason, you have these different ones, or these different feelings or different ways of investing the social field, that sort of detachment is a really, really interesting way of characterizing schizophrenia, because it makes it, it might be individual and genetic on one level, but it's a lot more interesting to think about what the schizophrenic says about how everything else is working, instead of just treating them like a sort of isolated incident.
Yeah, and it speaks to like I hesitate to call it a social schizophrenia, but really we saw how the despotic machine has the paranoiac, right? That I think they even call it the mega paranoiac machine, right? Because it's supposed to contrast the mega machine of the earth. And actually, it is a really good foil they make there. But that said, right, like the fact that the despotic machine is paranoiac in that way, right? Social relations are paranoiac, and not in the sense of everybody's, everybody's fiending cloak and dagger, but it speaks to more of like something a little bit more than just throwing symptoms and seeing how they stick, right? Like the way they're talking about paranoia and schizophrenia is not reducible to like anxiety, feverish desire, delusions of grandeur, right? Like that. And that's part of the point too, because what they've, I think, done really well, right? Because we're talking about codes now: delusions of grandeur, paranoia, schizophrenia. I think they've done a really nice way of enunciating something with that code that doesn't seem to really fall back on just repetition, right? Like I don't think when they talk about the paranoiac machine as the despot or those relationships, it suffices to just talk about symptoms anymore, especially since we're talking about active investment or cathesis here.
Yeah, like that a lot. I'm reminded of the phrase group fantasy. I don't know if we ever walked out like a real definition for that back when we were reading it in section 2. But I come back to that phrase sometimes when I'm thinking about this book, and what I'm getting from it is that like every fantasy is a group fantasy. Quote, I think from chapter 2 somewhere.
I think it's chapter 1. And I think we actually talked about it a few sessions ago. I'm not sure in which one. Yesterday. I don't remember that.
Just talked about it for a little bit. But it's on page 64, I think. Yeah, 64. That's where they mention the pseudo individual fantasy and the group fantasy.
Well, then I wonder, should we think about Oedipus as if it's a group fantasy? Are those things similar? Because they don't really give a good definition. I remember they don't really explain what they mean by that, and I had to like try to look it up. Is the Oedipal triangle a group fantasy?
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, my computer is going not schizo but ballistic on me. That's what I mean when I say like the social and the individual. Although I don't mean to draw a hard dichotomy, but like, because like I said, I don't know Lacan very well, so I don't quite know what he means by individual or group, but as I understand, like with group dynamics and that, right, like you can do the Freudian thing where you've got the superego and what the society says like speaks at you, but that doesn't quite explain how you're investing in it and how it mutually flows and reinvests through different people, right? Like they talk about stock and things like that, right? Like there's kind of like an economics there where it's not so reducible to like a voice speaking, right? Even for the Erstat or like the state as barking dog, like it may be a barking dog, but there's all these people making that happen, and then we're part of that, and not at a level where we can exclude each other, right? So like with what you're talking, as I understood that part in the earlier section of the book, it seemed to me like they were saying like, yes, you might fantasize, you might have ideas, even you might have conceptions, be that dreams, be that a certain lustiness, or be that like ideas about what you want to be in society or what you want to do in society. But those come with social relationships. Not only are they socially conditioned, but it's reflexive, right? So like they mutually act on each other. And so like to make the final point, that's kind of what I mean when I say like even with the individual, right? Like the superego still would seem to kind of be at this individual level, but where I see them moving is like, yeah, maybe you've got your assemblage as yourself, and sure, but that is also in relation to these social machines, and right, that's in relation to the territories and the codes, and at that level, I think that's what they're talking about with group fantasy, is that like even when I fantasize about, say, being a lawyer, that fantasy is only possible in relation to judges, juries, clientele, criminality. All these things don't necessarily condition it, although there are conditions there, but they form like a gumbo, right? Like it's an admixture that makes that possible.
I love the image of a gumbo.
I'm taking that from Ice Cube.
So on the notion of superego, I think we have there. So my understanding of the superego was always that it's kind of a solution to the problem that we kind of need to conceptually integrate individuals into the totality of society or whatever. I don't know. As I understand it, that's kind of left over from Hegel, and I don't know Hegel. But I think this whole thing so maybe what you just said maybe understood in a move away from this dichotomy between a totality and individual, which is consistent with the whole perspective of individuation, I think.
Thank you for that. Well, keep going.
Because we so like I don't actually understand this whole thing, but my understanding was that even in the later part, like in ATP, then the rhizome and all that stuff is basically an attempt to overcome this thinking in a duality or dialectic between a totality and something specific, or structure and individual, all that stuff.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think so, because like if we can't just transplant the superego, right? If it doesn't look like that, right? And that is just me speaking of representation there in a sense, but yeah, if we can't just rely on the totality of the model to explain it, then you're right, we find a lacuna, right?
Okay, so has anyone anything left to say about this part? Because I would have another question conceptually, but that's more related to Marxism than psychoanalysis.
The final comment, I think we should rename it the Uber Ego in relation to the Übermensch.
I mean, in German, it's actually the same word, right? Like used for Über-Ich and Übermensch. It's both the Über part is the same.
That was my attempt at a joke. So thank you all for bearing with me. Turns out there's linguistic precedence, so I've stumbled upon an actuality I sought to avoid.
Okay, so I'll go to Marx. And that's something they've talked about earlier. Again, this is a summary chapter. On page 270, they talk about what Marx said about Luther and Adam Smith and Ricardo, and how this relates to what they say about Freud. And specifically, they say that Marx said that Luther's merit was to have determined the essence of religion no longer on the side of the object, but as an interior religiosity. And the merit of Adam Smith and Ricardo was to have determined the essence or nature of wealth no longer as an objective nature, but as an abstract and deterritorialized subjective essence, the activity of production in general. Now, I know enough of Luther to understand what the point of Luther is, but I can't, and I know that this is basically what Marx said verbatim, but I haven't really understood what exactly subjective means in this context. And I wondered whether anyone could clarify that.
I will take a stab. It's often struck me as strange that, and you actually, I don't know if anybody here watches the American TV show Pawn Stars. And if you do, call them Battletoads, right? No, don't do that. Anyways, it's always struck me as weird, and I saw in that show that people read Adam Smith because it's supposed to be a handbook to you making money. And I think that's kind of what they're getting at with this interiority too for Luther. That is to say, it seems to me that kind of what they're getting at is that, like, even with capital and labor as quanta, and even happiness, right, like utility and utils, which I think was still in vogue at this time. I don't think economists were off quantification of happiness just yet, but that seems to me to come with a subjectivity. And oddly enough, like, I think kind of the trick here is trying to understand the subjectivity in relation to the deterritorialization. That for me is kind of like the knot to unfurl there.
Yeah, I mean, no, actually, I actually wonder what the Marxist sense of subjective is that they are invoking here, because, well, on Luther's side it's pretty easy. You have like Luther moves the relationship to God to a personal relationship. Like, what's actually important is your personal relationship to God. That's the move that Luther makes. And that kind of fits with a colloquial understanding of what subjective means. I really hate these terms, subjective and objective, because they are basically completely bastardized in popular discourse. Like, they basically just mean true and opinion right now in popular discourse. And I'm trying to figure out what exactly the technical meaning in the Marxist sense that they are invoking here is.
I'm thinking that it has to do with the subject in terms of, like, politics, like the subject of laws, right? The person who is it writes into the social contract, the person who has rights, the person who is described by the legal apparatus of a state. So it's sort of like, I mean, I think in this example, you can read it in terms of like subjectivity being, an individual experience of wealth, that sort of way of reading it. But you can also read it in terms of like the, political structure exists such that individuals moving wealth around is the, basis of the economy in the sort of a liberal capitalist sense. And I think that would fit with the way that Marx would use it. That, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Because they then go on and talk about Freud. And the same thing must be said of Freud. His greatness lays in having determined the essence or nature of desire no longer in relation to objects, aims, or even sources, territories, but as an abstract subjective essence, libido or sexuality. But he still relates this essence to the family as the... Yeah, okay, that's the caveat.
I think Muskie's on the right track, though, where it's like, and this kind of relates to how I think about cash as the capital, cash as Celsius, but like it, and hopefully my Pawn Stars thing helped with this, but it seems to me like the subjectivity is almost in the representation here, or in this idea of production as Ricardo and Smith laid it out, or for Freud. And there's a certain way that connecting with that, with social machines and desiring machines, allows for that, especially that third synthesis where the territories are extremely important. But it seems like that connection is contingent on this essence here, or if it is an essence, on what they've given as a deterritorialized essence.
Yes, because in chat, Hera brought just up both Smith and Marx subscribe to a labor theory of value. Yes, and I think that's exactly what they are talking about. But that's why I'm kind of getting stuck here, because in our contemporary parlance, the labor theory of value wouldn't is positioned in opposition to a subjective theory of value. I don't know the actual terms that economists use these days, but in Marx terms, subjective means something different, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly subjective means in the terms of Marx's labor theory of value.
I kind of take it to be like, if you want subjectivity, you kind of have to think of yourself within the confines of labor theory, or labor theory of value, though I'm not sure how satisfying that is.
Okay, so could you apply what you just tried to explain about Marx to what they say about Freud?
Well, their point seems to be, at least Ricardo and Luther didn't bring it all back to the triangle of the family, right? So, right, like so in what I just said, in terms of like, if you want to, experience like some subjectivity, right? Like if the subjectivity is acting upon you, which is probably the better way to say it, right? In the way things are doing and happening, where the connections, right? The quanta kind of, that's more or less, right? Like it's deterritorializing you, but that movement through that is where the subjectivity seems to be. It seems like the critique here of Freud is that, like, okay, Freud, so you managed to do something similar with libido, even though it's not exactly through labor theory, but you closed off that system through the family, right? Because I think even with Luther and the classical economists, or at least Smith and Ricardo, there's still these open systems, like what they talked about with the debt economy, and how that's actually an open rather than closed economic system. So that seems to be like, at least as I'm thinking about this right now, at the heart of this is that, well, at least they have open systems. Freud closed his off, even though he's using a similar sort of, he has a comparable mechanism or force here.
I don't know if I'd say capitalism is an open system, but I think that mechanism, your description of the mechanism that they're outlining, is totally right. The reason I say I don't know if capitalism is open is because I'm sort of reminded of the like Mark Fisher idea, right? The like capitalist realism, like can we even imagine an alternative anymore?
Fair point. But I think even with this, their point about the debt economy being an open system for the territorial for the primitive territorial representation, I think that it extends to capitalism. I could be mistaken there, but I think that notion of open debt, and I think this is right in line with like the falling rate of profit and all that other good Marxist economics, right? I think that's right in line with it because you do need that open. You need debt to kind of keep moving outward, right? And that's kind of why the family gets problematized the way it does, or at least like problematized, and then the incest taboo, right? Because you need the outwardness for perpetuation.
So you're saying that the incest taboo is sort of a way to push, I guess, push towards exogamy, right?
Exogamy for the sake of, and I'm speaking strictly in the primitive here, but exogamy for the sake of prolonging surplus value of code.
Yeah, I think I agree. That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting because I'm reminded of the way that like the way that certain families, I'm thinking about, okay, so on the American sitcom Modern Family, there's a gay couple and they very much replicate the nuclear family by like adopting a kid, and like, there's a masculine and a feminine role in the house. And it's interesting because that seems to be the family sort of moving out into spaces where it wouldn't have been like the sort of capitalist axiomatic, right? Where it's constantly pushing into places where it wouldn't be before.
To your point, and I can only say this because I've seen Modern Family, I agree with what you're saying, and I would point out that kind of like the underlying, right? So like the reason I think that holds water is that even with the gay couple, no, it's not even a couple, right? They're married. With those two husbands, that all still works in relation to the nuclear family that is Ed O'Neill and Sofia Vergara's. Well, I guess she marries in, but maybe that's the point. But anyways, that is still the nuclear family, right? Is that one of the husbands is the sibling of another wife, and that these kids have these different relationships as a family, right? As a family in relation to Grandpa Ed. And forgive me, I don't remember any of the characters' names.
That's fine. I actually don't either.
It's been, I just remember Haley, unfortunately, but that is still the nuclear family, right? Even though there's this family for the gay couple, right? It's still within this larger familial triangle, right? Like it's still, and this is almost where it's like a Russian nesting doll in a sense, although I think it will actually find that it's just an illusion of a nesting doll. It's all familial.
Yeah, as soon as you said triangle, I was like, it's triangles all the way down. At every level, it's a triangle again and again and again.
Yeah, which suggests to me that maybe there isn't even a series of triangles. Maybe it's, and that's kind of what I'm getting at too. Like, it just depends where on the level you're looking, right? But those levels are possible because there's a larger familial nucleus, which is the point of that show, right? Modern Family. It's supposed to be the family with that sense of like, oh, my brother's gay and I'm friends with his husband. And like you're saying, there's still the gender binary. And like that, they both move. And even if you watch it, right, both both men do kind of move through masculinity and femininity, but as with anything, right, like they tend to kind of be still polarized, right? Like they're supposed to be a woman and a man, even if they do kind of go vacillate a little bit.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a shockingly accurate description of the show, but I've also never seen it. So, but I do like, I do think what we're seeing here is like, you know, the proliferation of an Oedipal triangle. Maybe it's not totally fair example because it's a sitcom. So we're talking about representation, kind of a second order away from the way people are living it. But you know, there's that first big triangle that has the sort of the first generation of children, and then there's another one, and it's proliferating again, and then presumably as the children from the first marriages grow up, they proliferate a triangle in their households, and it's that pattern that they're talking about of one of the ways to resolve the Oedipal triangle is to, you know, occupy it. You have to recreate it.
Yeah, and so to walk this back to Lou's question, and maybe he, because it is a really interesting. I'm glad you picked out this passage. Maybe you can give us some more thoughts on. But to walk it back to your question now, I think that's kind of the point here, right? Is like, so sexuality, libidinal energy, right? Because at least for Freud, libidinal energy is not always sexual, although more often than not is. But either way, that concept of sexuality and the libidinal, we can see here that it is kind of, especially in the modern family sense that we've just walked out, it appears to be locked in the familial, right? So it's caught in a sort of closed off circulation.
It's interesting that this notion of like openness or abundance or sort of infinite resources in nature to be exploited, that's quite new to capitalism. And like if you go back as far as, well, originally in the Christian myth, the world belongs to God and its fruits belong to the people. And then you have Aquinas who says, yeah, you can claim property, but when it comes to needs, when it comes to like if a mother is starving and she needs to feed her kids, everything is public property. And then you have Smith who says you can always claim land to be yours, or like the homestead principle, but it's still labor theory of value in a sense. But he still delimits it with this caveat that, well, there's enough for everyone else to go and claim their own land. And this seems to have fallen out of favor, this idea that you're only allowed to go out and claim land and make it your private property because nature is infinite. And we seem to have realized that the resources are not infinite, but to have kept this push of like, yeah, claim it, you know? So I wonder if that's at all relevant, but your discussion about openness and sort of the expansion of capitalism reminded me of this historical development.
Even with surplus value of code, right? Even if we're dealing with so much, so much wool, because, right, that's what Marx uses in his economic analysis, wool and coats. Even if you're dealing with so many wool, so many aspects of wool and, so many rolls of wool, try saying that 3 times fast, so many rolls of wool and so many coats, like that exchange seems to come with that, again, a surplus value of code, right? So like to your point here, I think you're probably right that like Smith and the others believe that there's enough to go around. And actually, I think even the Wealth of Nations, right? There's this sort of taboo passage of Smith where he talks about like a wealth tax, right? So like if somebody dies with way too much property, and I think he even gives a number, the state should redistribute that wealth, right? And that's Adam Smith. So I think you're probably right that he has in mind ideas of a certain fairness and some idea of distribution in that regard, but also to get to the point of like, even if there isn't infinitude, right? And I think it's probably in both that they're not. With that expansion comes the whole debtor-creditor relationship and the what appears to be this prolonging of debt, and in connection with debt, the surplus value of code, despite finite resources, and factually, in virtue of finite resources.
Yeah, I think most modern capitalist theorists just denounce completely. I don't remember what it's called. It's called like the. I'll find out, but there's like a clause in Adam Smith that they just completely denounce about this sort of upper limit on like you can only claim more private property if public property is infinite or like unbounded.
So I'm going to try to reformulate the point about the subjective essence. And I'm going to do this, I try to do this without jargon. So I think what they are getting at here is, or what Marx's point earlier is that, as in the case of Luther, where faith and religion becomes like defined by your praxis, like by human doing, basically. Adam Smith, with his value theory of labor, achieves the same for wealth, and that value is now dependent not on the properties of the objects, but dependent on human praxis, on human doing. Yes, on the work you do. And that's basically the notion of subjective essence, right? Like the wealth as faith is dependent on an acting subject, or on a subject that acts and constitutes it, right? Like that's the whole point about Entfremdung. What's the Entfremdung thing in English? I don't know. Yes, alienation is how we basically, like, it's more technical, but basically we forget that value is achieved through our doing. It's objectified and becomes this objective thing that's independent of our subjective acts. So, and now the turn to Freud would be that what Deleuze and Guattari see in Freud, and I think is that libido and sexuality are not. They see the potential to not define it as lack, right? That has to be it, because basically when we define as libido and sexuality as dependent on objects, that's where we get lack. But it's a positive energy, like positive in the sense that it's in surplus, a reservoir of energy, and not like a lack that needs to be, like a hole that needs to be filled, right? And that's the connection. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's really well argued. Because I think you got it. I think you said it quite nicely, right? For Luther, our faith is what we do. For Smith, in a sense, right, our wealth is what we work, right? And we can debate how these hold up in practice, but I think you're right. For Freud, our sexuality is, shall we say, what we connect with, to put it in a PG-13 friendly way, but with the caveat, as they seem to be pointing out, that what we connect with in relation to the familial.
Yes, they early in chapter 2, they talked about I need to look that up before I can talk about. They talked about 2 modes of modeling the psyche. Like, I need to look that up.
If I understand too, like to kind of open this up, to open up, or to rather to dig deeper into your argument, it would seem to me too that, right, if your faith is what you do and your wealth is what you work, and your sexuality is what you connect with, if you know what I'm saying. So with that, right, like it also seems to be like you're saying, there's this potential there, but there's also, it seems to be this this point about, like, since it's no longer the objective nature of things, right? Like you're saying, it's no longer about the the objects of faith you have, the objects of wealth you have, and I guess whatever sexual objects you're looking for. But since it is this more like, or at least what we're saying, like it has the potential to be what you're doing, it seems to me too, though, that there might be an implicit caveat in the sense that they're talking about a deterritorialized subjective essence, which, as I'm thinking about it, seems to be like, okay, so we've got this idea that what I work for is my wealth, right? Without going into Weber. And so in that, right, like there's a certain subjectivity with that, even though that is very impersonal of me and everyone else in the system, right? My wealth is what I work for. But again, that's not going to take into account the system and or at least not very explicitly, the system, and it's not going to include me, it's not going to include Lou, it's not going to include Muskie, right? Because it's deterritorialized. In a similar way with sexuality, right? Like, it, especially when we're talking about like mothers and fathers, right? Like that's not you or me. That's the familial, right? And that seems to be part of the critique, is like, that's, not only is there perhaps a weakness or a point that these that Luther and the classicalists are not going far enough, but Freud is actually faced with a larger shortcoming.
I think generally you're right, but I think the point, like they don't spell that out, and I think they don't spell the critique on the classicals out because that's what Marx did, right? So basically, they are positioning themselves as to Freud as Marx is to Smith and Ricardo. And that's the whole thing about autocritique also, where they talk about bringing Oedipus to autocritique just as Marx brings Capital to autocritique. That point I got from the guy who wrote that intro book, Holland.
No, I appreciate that, and that does make, especially with when you gave that passage about the autocritique. Actually, I found that really convincing, because I think you're right that Marx does provide the autocritique. I'd be curious who did that to Luther, but yeah, I really like that counterpoint.
Weber, actually. Maybe, don't know.
Whether or not he did it, I'm going to go with hashtag Weber always.
Did we have a Weber discussion that I did not notice? No,
it's not an easy sell, man. Some of our Marxist friends are still looking for the Marxist group, so it's hard sell with Weber.
I don't think Weber needs to be read in opposition to Marx, actually. Frankfurt School would agree with me.
I also agree, but it's too often in sociology 201 or 101 taught in opposition. But I agree with you. And the Frankfurt School, hashtag Hannah Arendt.
I need to go on record and say that the clause I mentioned was not by Smith, but by Locke. It's called the Lockean proviso, and it's kind of denounced by modern free market theorists.
Sorry, say that again.
So like earlier, I mentioned how Aquinas and Smith both sort of delimited the claim.
Mike was cutting out, and I fear that now it has fully cut out. Hera, if you can hear me and are speaking right now, type yes in chat, because I can only see your green wreath. And I'll remind you, it's only October. Those come out only for December 25th and never again. Yep, you lost me with this one, Lou.
I googled
get the Pierce. That's it.
I googled for infinite semiosis or unlimited semiosis earlier, and that was one of the things that came up farther down in the Google image search.
That is both fascinating and depressing.
This is incomprehensible. I have no idea what this means.
I would be curious. Is this a 45-45-90 there, Lou?
Why are some of them only on 2 of the points and not on the third one?
Obligatory, since it's Stuart Mill. It's for the better good of the community.
I feel like I'm looking at the time cube.
That second link seems to be what it's from, but I can't actually see the content of that thing, so I don't know how Google got that image.
Yeah, I will say though, because at least what I'm getting out of this triangle, for nothing else, if not a point of departure, is like code. Because I see Pierce, and it looks like they're talking about maybe semiotics, maybe interpretation, maybe words. But it strikes me too, like when I think of like the surplus code and all that, like when I think of like online shopping, and since today is Amazon Prime Day, it seems like an appropriate day to talk about this. Like there's something with like the code there where like in online shopping there's this great excitement, right? And it seems like there's some subjectivity and there's intensities and affects, right? But in the same way, like that's very quickly gone once the act of shopping is gone, right? And that seems to me to be like indicative of like at least it seems to be like a deterritorialization in the sense that like you seem to have been working to produce a surplus value of code in that connectivity, right, by online shopping. But that's quickly gone, isn't it? And likewise, I would even think like if you're selling something on Prime Day, and I'm thinking of an individual person here, but perhaps more so even if you're participating in helping companies do this, if you work for Sony in sales, because you're so unfortunate. In that same way, right? Like there would still seem to be that this sense of like excitement that's sort of like, I don't want to say alien to you, but it's not really your excitement, is it? Because you're not really in it, are you? Or to be more clear, you're there, right? Like you're doing the shopping and that, but that act of shopping and like the codes around that give the surplus value. Whereas you like is being deterritorialized and these other things being deterritorialized as money's moving in that, it doesn't seem to me to be like Marxist alienation where like you're just not the real man. And that is to say, like, I don't mean to sound like perhaps Freudian in that. That is to say, like, you're just not, you're not human in that regard, or like, you're alien from what you should be. More so to say, like, not only are you not in the representation, but all the intensities in that aren't really like, aren't exactly in relation to you. Like even at least for me, I think even the sense of like excitement at buying a new scooter or whatever it is I need or want still seems kind of like maybe displaced, but certainly not full.
So I honestly can't tell anymore if we're still talking about this chapter or are in full shitpost territory. That's not a good sign, I think.
Delirium.
Right. Take us
Woohoo.
back, Lou.
Well, I mean, I think a lot about reading this book and being in a shopping environment, though. I think that because I work at the grocery store and I'm watching these like flows of people, right, just constantly passing in front of me, but they're mostly like they aren't really being recorded, right? Like mostly I don't recognize any of them. And yeah, it's just this like they're just receipts, they're just flows of money. Maybe there is like some sort of hollowness, but I don't know if that's subjective or not. Maybe I just occupy a site on the store's, maybe I just occupy coordinates in that store that just are disaffected coordinates. Yeah, they're recorded as flows of money and flows of goods, but not really as like people, which is sort of walking that line between Marxist alienation and what this book brings to it.
Yeah, that has been one of the guiding points for me, especially because I know Lou is so fond of Marxist theory. I thought I'd take us there.
I don't have no response to that. I've got nothing against Marx. I don't like reading him.
I'm only kidding you, man. But I do think that's an interesting juxtaposition is like deterritorialization in relation to alienation, because it seems to me that like they've got something really interesting, and it does seem to be a different picture than alienation suggests, right? Because like whereas alienation would say like the real man is not there, right? So like when you're working for Sony doing, I don't know, selling headphones, right? Like you're not getting to be the real person because it's alienated there. Whereas their point seems to be, no, you're still being a person, or more so like you're still a body, and all these desiring machines are there, and the connections are happening, and the social machines are there. But what you're experiencing is not the absence of you being a real person, but the sense that like the intensities in that that are otherwise possible, perhaps even virtual in some sense, aren't making it to you, because there's the territoriality for them, for the ego, or at least for the subject to engage them isn't provided.
I'm reminded of what they talk about a little in 310, where they talk about the capitalist machine being pitiless and cynical.
Yeah, and that speaks to employers, right? Like even when your manager is on the same page as you, right? There's a sense that they're going to give you a cynical take, even if they disagree. And it's like that story about the judge, right? Like even if I agree with you, right? And it becomes a point of cynicism. Like you're saying, I'm still going to do this because that's kind of the titular responsibility, right? That's what my position, and like that's what the representation, at least, and those connections kind of are moving toward.
They talk about cynicism in this section for a bit on page 268 in relation to bad conscience, which is also interesting because it brings us back to the superego stuff, because bad conscience and the superego basically come from the same source, right? Like Nietzsche's bad conscience is pretty clearly one of the sources for Freud's conception of the superego.
Could you say more about that? I always think of bad conscience in relation to Sartrean bad faith.
We should have done this reading of the genealogy of morals, because I thought about that when I read the genealogy of morals, but is months ago. No, I actually can't say much to that. But it's basically, I'm not actually sure how bad conscience is used colloquially in English, but in German, the translation is actually schlechtes Gewissen, which actually kind of corresponds to a colloquial notion of what the superego is. Like, actually, when you are introduced to Freud, the actual words that Nietzsche uses in his system are the words that are used to explain Freud's superego in colloquial terms.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Sartre's bad faith is like when you're okay. It's the waiter at the restaurant, right? That's the example he gives, where he's doing like shit at his job, not out of the fullness of his being or his desire to be there, but because he has to, because he's like compelled to. And I think that that's related to what Nietzsche's talking about, but it's not exactly the same thing. I think the way that I think of bad conscience is that the will can turn back on itself and sort of, I guess that's what makes the idea clear to me. It's not just shame, and it's not just doing something that you don't want to do. It's that you can have a desire and then turn it back and desire the opposite, right? You'd rather desire nothing. You'd rather desire nothingness than not desire. It's sort of like self-mortification. That's how I sort of think about it, yeah. Which is related to the superego, right? Because the superego is the total apparatus of self-mortification, of like moralizing yourself or making yourself feel bad about yourself. But it's not just limited just to self-mortification. It's not just that.
Yeah, I think that helps. It sounds like for Nietzsche and for Freud, right? Like it's like the conscience that we were talking about as the voice of society, whereas for Sartre, it's more like, that sounds like it's a little bit more personal, with your conscience saying like, you do better, you should be doing better, right? You shouldn't, at least as I understand, like the bad faith is like, you know better than that, or you know better than you do, so to speak. Or I should be clear there, you know better than you act.
Yeah, that makes sense. That these all seem like similar, like aspects of a similar idea, right? The trying to explain where things like shame come from, or something.
I've tried to make it into a nice one-liner. It seems like for Sartre, you know better than you act, as opposed to like for the superego more so like you better act as you know, as you socially know more so.
I wonder if we want to take a stab at Tiernan's question, because they've asked it twice now, and I'm not fully sure I have a good answer.
Go for it.
It looks like what they're asking is, are D&G saying that Freud played a big role in assigning the family to the last territory, and that is why we apply it to the family to the social field?
Okay, so I mean, I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that, but they have a section where they kind of address that. On page 269, they say, once again, psychoanalysis does not invent Oedipus. It merely provides the latter a last territoriality, the couch, and a last law, the analyst as despot and money collector. But the mother as the simulacrum of territoriality, and the father as the simulacrum of the despotic law, with the slashed, split, castrated ego, are the products of capitalism insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in the other social formations. Actually, I think that's a complete answer, right? Like, the territoriality is oh no, maybe you'll have to say something about that.
I like that. I like that as an answer a lot. It sort of gets at what they've been doing in this whole section, where they go through mother territoriality. Well, that's the first thing that they were talking about with the territorial body of the earth. And then the father as the law, the despot, and then the castrated ego. Like it seems like they're going through these social formations and providing examples of like, okay, here's where it fits into psychoanalysis. Here's the person that embodies it in psychoanalysis. It does make me sort of have other questions though, but I want to answer Tiernan's question satisfactorily first.
I'm still struggling to really get a good question formulated because I'm just trying to generate like the big picture, how exactly like Oedipus plays in this because I have all the tiny little pieces, but yeah, this is definitely very helpful, but I guess the next thing I need to really get into, and this might be a stupid question, is why exactly these things are the product of capitalism, as it says there. Is it, you think, because when capitalism reterritorializes in the way that it resuscitates the Earth stat, it reaches for the image of the family, maybe?
The first answer I thought was that it's contingent. I think maybe I'm wrong, but I'm reading this section as if Deleuze and Guattari are kind of working backwards, that they're starting with an analysis of Oedipus as it was produced in a certain society, and then they work backwards and they produce these images of other societies to explain the logical jumps that resulted in the Oedipus and the analysis that they make at the end. Does that help? So it's sort of like they're doing that Deleuze thing where it's philosophy is the production of concepts and less like they're less like uncovering this like secret plan to like it's contingent. They started with an analysis of Oedipus and then they went back and produced these stages of history in order to sort of properly situate it in the social context that they were already analyzing from the beginning.
Typically they call, see this with like Foucault and Derrida, points of departure.
So they did a complete migration, just like Oedipus does a complete migration, where they started at this point, started with this analysis of psychoanalysis, this auto-critique of Oedipus, and then they went all the way through these sort of anthropological departures and then came back to Oedipus.
Yeah, because I think part of the genealogy is that there's an Oedipal trajectory.
I would agree with that. I think that the Oedipal trajectory was what I was trying to like gesture towards, the sort of parallelism between the Oedipal trajectory that they map out and the one that Lacan maps out.
Nice contrast.
Also, I think it's important to keep in mind that what this last section of chapter 3 here does is summarizing the whole chapter 3. Like, we don't have the nuances here all laid out, right? This is a summary of the whole analysis of chapter 3. So actually, I think this helps. The section has helped me a lot of getting a bit more to know the connections between the elements they introduced throughout the chapter, but to really understand the mechanics of how they conceive of this production of Oedipus, we probably would need to go back and go through this whole chapter, if not the whole book again. And I'm sure I will do that sooner or later.
To quote Muskie, oh boy, I just finished reading Anti-Oedipus. Time to read Anti-Oedipus again. Or likewise in this case, oh boy, I finished chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus. Time to start the book again.
It's endless semiotics. I finished reading a sentence in Anti-Oedipus. Time to read the sentence over again.
Every damn time.
Working backwards, re-evaluating the whole text you've read so far after every new sentence.
I like that idea. What if we do another series on Anti-Oedipus, but this time we read backwards from chapter 4 to chapter 1?
I thought we read a sentence and then we wait a whole week and then we read that sentence and the next sentence and then we wait a whole week and then
Yeah, so this YouTube series that basically reads Hegel that way.
Oh, that's crazy. That's going to take like 100 years.
I would suggest you could finish Finnegan's Wake faster.
So, Tiernan, did that help at all? I know we got kind of silly at the end there, but...
Could we get that sentence read aloud again? The one
I'll
Lou read?
put it in chat.
Once again, psychoanalysis does not invent Oedipus. It merely provides the latter a last territoriality, the couch, and a last law, the analyst as despot and money collector. But the mother as the simulacrum of territoriality, and the father as the simulacrum of the despotic law, with the slashed, split, castrated ego, are the products of capitalism insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in the other social formations.
So I guess what we would need to clarify is the relationship between the images, the simulacra, and the territoriality.
Okay. So what can you be a little more specific about what in the last part is confusing?
Well, so where they say that these things are the products of capitalism insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in the other social formations.
So I think I read that as that this sort of Oedipus thing is, that's what I mean when I say it's contingent, right? That they started with an analysis of the society that they are currently living in, and they pointed out all the ways that capitalism has engineered and like produced this way of looking at individuality with their conversation about deterritorialized flows or the personalization of power, and that's I think what they're getting at, that because the split castrated ego is 100% language borrowed from Lacan, and they're getting at like Lacan can only say these things within a certain type of society, and that this type of society has a huge impact on the way we experience our psyches and the way that psychoanalysis can be enunciated. It's sort of, yeah. I think that makes sense, right? Because every movement of deterritorialization is accompanied with reterritorialization. So this is sort of the psychoanalysis setting up the territory of the psyche within the context of a certain society that is about the movement of deterritorialized flows, decoded flows, and sort of setting up the right limits and adjusting the limits appropriately.
And the contrast between capitalism and the other systems and this operation that they talk about in the sentence. I think that's what they lay out in the beginning of the section, like on page 263 following. But that's a bit long to read all.
I do want to bring up though that this particular sentence that we've looked at, the sort of resonances with a kind of accelerationism is interesting, or maybe a sort of the Mark Fisher thing again, like capitalist realism, because it almost, when they say like a last territoriality, a last law, does that mean that they really think that capitalism is sort of the end of history, right? Is their universal history finished? And it's a tough question. I don't know if I have an answer.
At the time of writing, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the answer that I give too. That basically it's the limit insofar as it's there's nothing beyond yet produced.
Exactly. If we're stuck with displacing the limit, and that's where we're at the time of writing, who knows what's next? Who knows if next is possible?
And I think they will actually introduce something beyond capitalism in the 4th chapter. I think that's the whole talk. Like, I haven't actually read the 4th chapter, but I know that there's some talk about the new Earth that will come up, I believe.
Ooh, that's a tantalizing note to finish on. I'm very curious about what types of speculation we can draw from this book about what the next form of society might look like. It gets at my big problem with the book so far about praxis that I've been sort of frustrated with the book for.
Well, it seems like one of the things that they're kind of ending on, particularly this section, right, is that with this problem of the familial as encroaching, right, be it sexuality or libido, be it social machines or desiring machines, right, there's still this last territoriality. And I'm thinking that if you accelerated the flow such that this territoriality goes away, perhaps then a new socius becomes possible, and that seems to be what the New Earth would provide. If I understand, I haven't read this next chapter, I'm only speculating, but it would seem to me that the New Earth provides that new socius, and perhaps more drastically, like, two, it would seem to me that with praxis comes, like, not just, to put it really, really simply, not just reacting to things.
I'm so amped about this dimension of the work, the sort of, we've gotten this really interesting way of connecting social like structures to individual psychology and how these two things are playing off of each other, and this really interesting analysis of that phenomena. And it, they've given us, I think, some sort of advice on how to live, in a personal way, right? Like Foucault says, this book is a book of ethics, of how to live a non-fascist life. Now I'm really, really interested in flipping it and turning it the other way and seeing what type of politics can we pull out from the book, not just about personal choice like life, but where can we go with this? If capitalism is the last territoriality and the last law, what can we do to smash it or to modify it or accelerate it? Oh no, it's another cube.
Yeah, the New Earth thing might be from ATP, but notice that the diagram by Holland also has a fourth system.
Yeah, as I've thought about it in my life, like, so you brought the political, like, when you're engaging in politics, like, so the other day I made a point about, like, if you put people on, like, it's like a board of directors, and we talk about diversity as it needing to look different, right? And so, like, you're just kind of playing with the representation in a sense there, right? Like, that's not necessarily going to change things. If you have an all-white board of directors and you put in 50% of it a different race, and they're still making the same decisions, what have you really accomplished, right? Like, yeah, it looks different, but aren't we still perpetuating many of the same problems? Like, or with, like, defund the police, and these are not, I'm not advocating positions one way or the other, but I do think there's a point to be made with defunding police, because the police provide so much revenue to different facets of society, especially because they move people through the judicial system, right? They move people into court, they get people arraigned, they get people bail, right? The police make a lot of that possible. One of the things that's going to be, and I think this is probably a big blind spot in the discourse right now, is, like, even if you move to social workers, are they going to start charging people for their services, right? Because again, you can connect this with associates here, with all that cash seeming to kind of go away, right? Like, that's going to be a big problem for cities, especially cities, and we can talk about structural racism here too. If that is relied upon that heavily, the city is going to see a giant decline in revenue, and that's going to affect social services, right? So my point being, it's not as simple as just, you can't just take a peg out of the Jenga thing and see if the tower falls or not, right? Like, I think in a roundabout way to get to an answer to your question, Muskie, like, to do revolutionary things there, especially in terms of, like, revolutionary investment, it's going to take more than just going with the talking points. In fact, it might even take challenging them, right, which will merit its own reactions.
Yeah, I think I definitely am fully on board with the point you made about representation, right? That representation in itself is not revolutionary. It's a good thing, sure, that opportunity becomes more equal, but doesn't mean it's revolutionary, right? The police one is a different question, but it is a sobering realization of how much our economics are sort of tied up in the carceral state. I think you're dead on about that. I'm not sure what the revolutionary path to take is, but I would prefer. I know what I'd like prefer. So, but again, we weren't supposed to get into the advancing politics. It is a sobering realization to think about how much our economics is sort of wrapped up in the carceral system. And probably part of the problem of capitalism, I guess.
I think that's it, though. I think the revolutionary begins with that simple question of, well, okay, if we can't just look to whether it's the representation in discourse, the representation elsewhere, to explain this, and we've got to do it. I think that's probably where it begins, right? If we've got to start thinking about, okay, well, defunding the police sounds good, but there's a lot of so like we can use Foucault here, right? Like, so Bentham and the reformers took away the guillotine and gave us like the panopticon prison, right? And that's supposed to be more humane, but it comes with all new problems. It comes with all new, like you're saying, the economics adjust. A lot of stuff shifts, and like in a truly Foucauldian fashion, right? That's what he talks about, the quadrille, where some of the same things get concealed and some of the same things get revealed, right? It's like a sleight of hand in some ways. And I think starting with those points and starting with even criticism in this regard at least provides a starting point, because and I guess that's basically what I'm getting at, is we're basically going to have to start without an answer in some regard. That's not to say we can't look to things. That's not to say, like, what Marx said in the Brumaire is wrong, that we have to stop looking at history. But it is to say, like, we can't just use that to explain everything as a finality.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm reminded of, I've been skimming through Chaosophy a little bit, and I'll pull a little quote from Guattari that, or I'll paraphrase it basically, but it reminds me. Basically, he says, like, they ask Deleuze and Guattari, like, who's on the cutting edge of humanity, who's on the cutting edge of these, like, psychology and stuff, who are the avant-garde, I think is pretty much the exact question. And Guattari is like, well, I'm not sure that the schizophrenics aren't the avant-garde, right? He says something like schizophrenics might be the actual avant-garde in human society. And I think what I'm trying to get at is your point about, like, oh, we have to start without an answer. That's probably why Deleuze and Guattari sort of position the schizophrenic as the revolutionary person, because they're positioning a person who's, critique, right, whose questions, whose flows are so decoded that, like, reality itself kind of becomes an issue.
Well, and this is where enunciation is really important too. But yeah, I mean, that's effectively what I'm getting at, is that, like, again, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't, like, so then the question becomes, why read anti-Oedipus? Because we're not reading anti-Oedipus to solve all of our problems, right? I think Foucault is extremely salient in his remark that we shouldn't take this to be the new Hegel. In the same way, like, this is not a book to explain everything that's ever going to happen and has happened. That's not what we should use it for. And I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I had a disillusionment, a kind of moment with the book like that, but that's sort of a personal thing.
I mean, it's normal, right? Like, another way of saying is, this isn't going to be the new Upanishads. This isn't going to be the new Bible. And even then, our relationship with those texts can change, right? Where we don't need the book that, everything else follows from, or the system that everything else can be explained from, right?
It's so far, it's still one of my favorite books, I should go on to say, but I think I was really, really excited when I started reading it. And I really, really felt like I was, like, going to get some answers. And then kind of now that I'm at the end of the book, more or less, or looking back on it, I feel like I got a lot from the book, but I'm aware of how limited what I got is, in terms of, like, I know a lot more about psychoanalysis now as far as like what I can know about anything else, it's sort of been thrown into question. But but I do know more about Lacan than when I started.
It kind of sounds like you can't wait for us to get to 1,000 plateaus.
Very excited for 1,000 plateaus, indeed. Yes.
I'll second that. I was actually never going to read, well, I shouldn't say never. I was actually going to read 1,000 Plateaus and then 30 years later read Anti-Oedipus. But because of this server, the spontaneity of that caused me to reverse that. Lou, what do you think in terms of like what we're discussing?
I think I'm a bit tuned out, actually. Like, reading Anti-Oedipus for me was basically... Like basically I jumped in on the deep end because like my knowledge of psychoanalysis is basically non-existent. My knowledge of Nietzsche is basically non-existent. Generally, my knowledge of philosophy is basically non-existent. I know a bit of sociology and a bit of philosophy that relates to that, but basically, I was overwhelmed at every point of this reading, and am glad that I actually think I understand some trajectories. Like, I get a sense of where things are going. And I hope that... Actually, I feel like ATP will be a bit more productive for me, because now, a few months after we started Anti-Oedipus, I've read a lot of Latour, actually. And I've read a bit other stuff. I read more Bergson, which all helped me to actually relate this to sociology stuff that I actually know better. And I think that ATP is a much more clear connection to stuff that that's actually relevant for me right now. Like, psychoanalysis isn't that relevant for me right now. Like, it is if I actually want to deep dive into theory again. Because reading Deleuze and Guattari is not a deep dive in theory, apparently. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, psychoanalysis is a weird discipline. After like, this is basically the sum total of my like exposure to psychoanalysis in a I guess serious way. But it's a really weird discipline where it's useful in a lot of ways for like myself and for making like understanding into social interactions and stuff, and feeling satisfied about, you know, knowing smart stuff and but it's not really useful in terms of like, you know, literally anything material that I can affect unless I want to get really, really deep into theory.
Well, I mean, actually, if you read anything, you'll meet psychoanalysis, but in a lot of things you basically can ignore that it's there, right? Like, I've read some Judith Butler, and there is psychoanalysis going on there, but you can basically sail with what you get from her. And that's with a lot of stuff where I encountered psychoanalysis. But this book really supposes that you know your psychoanalysis. Like, especially in the second chapter, it really felt like this book was written for psychoanalysts, to show the psychoanalysts why they are wrong or what they are doing wrong and how they can do better. But well, that's not me, right?
Yeah, so much of this book has felt like a conversation that, you know, is really, really, what is it? That Deleuze and Guattari are having a conversation with other people that have read all these books and are like part of this conversation and have been for years. But I sort of always felt like I just like walked into the room and was just like, oh, okay, got to try to pick up what's going on now.
Yeah, exactly.
Consider this, though. Supposing you read this book, or supposing a person read this book and then went into psychotherapy. Total paradigm shift, right?
Well, I mean, when I started reading anti-oedipus, I was still in I don't know what's behavioral therapy. What's the English term for that? Cognitive behavioral blah. Difficult words. You know what I mean. Therapy, and I parted with my therapist, and she said I should probably look to get a psychoanalyst. So that will be fun. I haven't done that yet, but I might try that.
I've been in a pretty in a therapy session the whole time I've been reading this book with a doctor. I mean, and it is kind of, I did feel sort of hypocritical for a while reading this book and then going to therapy, but I don't think that this book is an anti-therapy book exactly either.
Hopefully my mic is on. I don't think it's anti-therapy either, but more so what I'm suggesting is that, well, one, you've probably gained a lot of tools to talk to a therapist as a therapist, and not as someone who's going to cure you, right? So, I don't want to suggest that they've given us the playbook, because I don't think that's quite right. But I do think, especially in this point about auto-critique, yeah, I first of all, I absolutely agree with you guys, right? There's a lot of stuff here that if a psychoanalyst read, they would immediately pick up on, right? And even if they don't know Lacan, the Freudianism alone would be, right, that would speak volumes. But even if you're not well versed in psychoanalysis, I suspect that with what they're discussing in terms of the unconscious and even Oedipus, and even with the remarks about well, here we are again on the couch with our feet up. Nice to be home, right? To that point, and even to their point about the familial, this does give you, as someone who's read it, quite a lot of room to actually critique your psychoanalyst during the session, or to talk about, like they're saying, right? Like you don't talk about it outside of the room. It's supposed to be confidential, yeah. But in that same way, it seems like some of what they're doing, especially in terms of this so-called last territory, is by bringing it to its auto-critique, making that much more difficult, and through those means that I've suggested.
Yeah, as to what Muskie said to it not being an anti-therapy book, I think it's an anti-therapy book, but one for therapists, like not for the patient.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I think it's a book that's it wants to do therapy differently. It doesn't want to do this same psychoanalytic playbook. It has problems with the whole Oedipal triangle thing, but it doesn't have problems with, and it has problems with the monetary, the sort of social structure that goes into therapy. I think all that's fair. But it doesn't have problems with the idea of psychotherapy. I think that that's clear based on what Guattari goes on to do it, or what he does at in his practices and stuff. That they don't have problems with the idea of trying to do this. It's that the way it's being done has problems, right? It's an anti-therapy book for therapists. It's for therapists to critique and do their own practice better. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, but I think also, and what I'm getting at is that even for the patient to go into that, there's a certain, it seems to me that you have to sort of be armed and ready for what you're going into in the regard that they're talking about, right? Like a battle cry of this would be, I'm not going to be Oedipalized.
I'm reminded of the section they talk about Schreber doing playful Oedipalization. I think about that section a lot. Yes, sure, the God can be my dad and the angels can be my older brother, but my mom was the Virgin Mary, and all the birds are also all these little girls, and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, exactly. Like even if you just harangue them, right, and screw with them, right, I'm not going to be Oedipalized. Or as I like to say, that's not what I'm experiencing.
Cool. That's actually an answer to the question about praxis. Kind of a crazy review session.
It's a start, and just to be clear, what I meant, so I don't get misunderstood, I don't mean to say that we can't look to this book for help, and that, like, when I say we don't start with an answer, I don't mean to suggest that we just, throw out what we've read and all that and start from scratch, because I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can make yourself a tabula rasa, even if you can make yourself a body without organs. But I do mean to suggest that, like, it's probably wise not to start as though because we read Marx, or because we read Smith, or because we read somebody, or because we listen to this discourse from an employer or what have you, that we now understand and have sort of like the panacea to the problems we arrive at, because I think that will only get us into further trouble.
Yeah, I second that, and that's just as true as of political projects as it is in therapy. Right, going into therapy and expecting to get a cure-all or an answer, or medication, expecting to get a cure-all from medication instead of just another tool to help with, your brain, or employment, or artistic creativity. Really, any of these things, going into anything expecting a cure-all. If anything, this is this book is anti cure-alls, because they're all paranoiac machines and despotic signifiers, and I do not think this is a good closing. Please cut this out.
Oh, but there is a point there, right? Like, the book, and I think you probably get this with most post-structuralism, like, even if we did have a new Hegel or a new Marx, would that really, don't we already have one? Is having a new one really going to get us out of our, doing the thinking and work for ourselves? Even, or to give it a different way, it's not always about starting a new group, is it? Right? Like, although we do it, one of the ways I interpret this genealogy is I've said I sometimes think about the server in this regard. Not to say that we're Oedipalizing, but because we're a group, and arguably there's a group fantasy here, yeah? And there's investment in that, right? There's cathexis. And it would seem to me that this book warns us of a possible trajectory, right? Of a possible Oedipal trajectory. And one of our challenges, especially if we do wish to be revolutionaries, is developing a cathexis, right? Because not just a praxis, but one that has this cathexis that doesn't just react against that and end up going with it. So honorary mention of Lou, who just, I think, wrote the best joke of the day. He wrote, "New Hegel is Derrida. Deconstruction is the new dialectics. Everyone talks about it. No one knows what it means." And with that, Lou's joke will take us to the end of this session. Thank you for joining us for this review session of Anti-Oedipus, Chapter 3, Section 11. Please join us again this coming Monday for Chapter 4, Section 1, which is called Introduction to Schizoanalysis, and Section 1 will be the social field, which seems very appropriate right now.
you.